hospitals at the age of 18. His first medical job was as a nurse's assistant at the Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. Donald's first few weeks at the hospital were uneventful, but something snapped within him along the way. Criminal psychologists were unable to explain what brought out his murderous tendencies, whether he was unable to cope with the pain and suffering around him, or maybe he simply enjoyed watching his victims die. According to Donald's later confessions, he considered himself an angel of death, or a mercy killer, but the details he eventually revealed about his first murder indicate otherwise. During an evening shift, just months after starting at the hospital, Donald committed his first murder. Years later, in a 1997 interview with Cincinnati Post, Donald described it. When he walked into a private room to check on a stroke victim, the patient rubbed feces in his face. Donald became angry and lost all control. He says, "The next thing I knew, I'd smothered him. It was like it was the last straw. I just lost it. I went in to help a man, and he wants to rub that in my face." Following the murder, Harvey cleaned up the patient and hopped into the shower before notifying the nurses. Just 3 weeks after committing his first murder, he killed again when he disconnected an oxygen tank at an elderly woman's bedside. As the weeks went by and no one detected foul play in his first 2 murders, Donald became more brazen. Whether out of boredom, opportunity, or experimentation, his methods varied with each murder. He used various items such as plastic bags, morphine, and a variety of drugs to kill more than a dozen patients in 1 year. In one case, he chose an exceptionally brutal method. The patient had an argument with Donald because he thought Donald was trying to kill him, and during the course of that argument, he reportedly knocked Donald out with a bedpan. Upon recovering from the blow, Donald waited till later that night, snuck into the patient's room, and stuck a coat hanger through his catheter. As a result of the puncture, infection had set in and the man died a few days later. No one ever questioned it, he said. He later confessed that during the 10-month period he worked there, he killed at least a dozen patients, smothering 2 of them with pillows and hooking the others up to near-empty oxygen tanks, all in an effort to ease their suffering. His second victim was killed in the room with a 12-year-old boy present. Donald insisted that he killed purely out of a sense of empathy for the suffering of those who were terminally ill, but also admitted that many of the killings were committed due to anger at the victims. In March 1971, he was arrested for burglary. While being questioned about this, Donald was drunk and began talking incoherently about the murders he had committed. The arresting officers looked into his claims and questioned him extensively about them, but in the end, they were unable to find any substantial evidence to back them up. Donald pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of petty theft the next day and escaped with just a $50 fine. The judge recommended psychiatric treatment for his troubled condition, but instead Donald chose to enter the Air Force. He served a 10 unspecified grounds. However, it was widely rumoured at the time that his superiors had learned of his confessions to the Kentucky police and did not want to deal with any similar matters in the future. Back home in Kentucky, Donald was twice committed to the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Lexington. His mother assigned the committals to mental disorders, with Donald kept in restraints, and his lawyers would later refer to a bungled suicide attempt. After receiving 21 electroshock therapy treatments, Donald emerged from the VA hospital with no visible improvements in his morbid condition. Concealing his record, Donald found work as a part-time nurse's aide at Cardinal Hill Hospital in Lexington in 1973. In June, he added a second nursing job at Lexington's Good Samaritan Hospital, remaining in that position for a further 5 months. The next year, he went on to another job, first as a telephone operator in Lexington, moving on to a clerk position in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. At this time, he was able to keep his killing urge in check, perhaps because he did not have the same access to the patients as he did at Marymount Hospital, which could also explain why he shifted from job to job during this time. But it became increasingly more difficult for him to manage these urges, finally driving him away from home across the border into Cincinnati. For the next 10 years up until 1985, Donald held a variety of positions at the Cincinnati VA Medical Center, working as a nursing assistant, a housekeeping aide, a cardiac catheterization technician, and an autopsy assistant. In the autopsy role, he sometimes stole tissue samples from the morgue, taking them home to study. Since he worked at night, he had very little supervision and unlimited access to virtually all areas in the hospital. On the side, he murdered at least 15 patients, supplementing his previous methods with an occasional dose of poison. He once joked with ward nurses after a patient's death, saying, "I got rid of that one for you." Donald's victims were not limited to suffering patients. After an argument with a neighbor, Diane Alexander, he laced her beverage with hepatitis serum, nearly killing her before the infection was diagnosed and treated by physicians. Another neighbor, Helen Metzker, was not so lucky. Donald put arsenic in one of her pies, and she died later that week. Outside of work, he sometimes practiced on his lover, Carl Howler. After moving in with him, Donald soon began poisoning him out of fear that his partner was being unfaithful, poisoning him after an argument, then nursing him back to health. In April 1983, Donald had an argument with Carl's parents and began to poison their food with arsenic. In May 1983, Carl's father, Henry, suffered a stroke and was remitted to Providence Hospital. Donald visited Henry there and placed arsenic in his pudding before leaving. Henry died later that night. Donald continued to poison Carl's mother, Margaret, off and on for the next year, but was unsuccessful in his attempts to kill her. In January 1984, Carl broke off the relationship with Donald and asked him to move out. Donald was angry at the rejection and spent the next 2 years trying to kill Carl with his poisonous concoctions. At one point, he even March 1987, he used cyanide to poison a man who was hospitalized after a motorcycle crash. This triggered an Ohio law requiring autopsies for all motorcycle fatalities. John Powell was comatose for several months following his crash, but had since started to recover. During the autopsy, an assistant coroner noticed the scent of almonds, a telltale sign of cyanide. But this ability to smell cyanide is genetic, and with other coroners it may have gone undetected. Authorities were unable to find any evidence or motive that pointed towards any of John Powell's friends or family members, so they soon began to focus on hospital employees who had access to Powell's room. The list was short, and upon learning Donald Harvey's hospital nickname, which was Angel of Death, given to him because he always seemed to be around when someone died, the authorities began to focus their entire investigation on him. Anonymous tips came flooding into the station from hospital staff and nurses who said they had filed complaints against Donald's behavior, but claimed they were ordered by supervisors to keep quiet. It seems that instead of being reported to police, employers had opted to simply fire Donald. After securing a search warrant for Donald's apartment, investigators found a mountain of evidence against him, including books on the occult and poisons. Over the years, he had amassed 30 pounds of cyanide, which he had slowly pilfered from the hospital and kept at home for safekeeping. He kept a precise diary of his crimes and took notes on each victim, detailing how he murdered them, such as pressing a plastic bag and wet towel over the mouth and nose, sprinkling rat poison in a patient's dessert, adding arsenic and cyanide to orange juice, injecting cyanide into an intravenous tube, injecting cyanide into a patient's buttocks. All the while, Donald was committing his crimes. He was refining his techniques by studying medical journals for underlying hints on how to conceal his crimes. Donald was then charged with one count of aggravated murder and held under a $200,000 bond when he filed a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. By August, he had confessed to a total of 33 murders, and bond was revoked 2 days later, with the new charges being filed. Donald realized that it was only a matter of time before they discovered the full extent of his crimes, and decided he should try to make a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty. So 35-year-old Donald sat down with the investigators and confessed to committing 33 murders over the past 17 years. As the days went by, that number eventually grew to 70 in total. The investigators were skeptical of the numbers Donald was giving them. His mental state was questioned, and he underwent psychiatric tests employed by experts. A spokesman for the Cincinnati prosecutor's office said, "This man is sane, competent, but is a compulsive killer. He builds up tension in his body, so he kills people." Donald, for his part, insisted that most of the murders were mercy killings, admitting that some, including attacks on friends and acquaintances off the job, had been done out of spite. In televised interviews, Donald discussed his fascination with black magic, but refused to discuss his views on Satanism. In August 1987, Donald pleaded guilty investigation into the remaining deaths was closed after investigators determined there was not enough evidence to pursue them. In a 1991 interview with a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch, Donald gave a glimpse into his mindset. He was asked, "Why did you kill?" "Well, people controlled me for 18 years, and then I controlled my own destiny. I controlled other people's lives, whether they lived or died. I had that power to control." He was asked, "What right did you have to decide that?" "After I didn't get caught for the first 15, I thought it was my right. I appointed myself judge, prosecutor, and jury, so I played God." In a 1987 interview with Cincinnati Post, Donald's mother, Goldie Harvey, recalled that her son was brought up in a loving family environment. She said, "My son has always been a good boy." Martha D. Turner, who was principal of the elementary school Donald attended for 8 years, backed up these comments in her own interview. She said, "Donnie was a very special child to me. He was always clean and well dressed with his hair trimmed. He was a happy child, very sociable and well liked.